Hi there, my name is Glennie LeBaron and I'm a current sophomore at Brown University. Right now I'm taking a course in political ecology. As part of my final project, I want to create an interpretive walk that goes through the history of the place of the John Hay Estate. So I want to thank you for coming on my online guided interpretive program. Normally I would love to have you come walking through the woods with me, but we're going to make do. We are walking on the historic John Hay Estate. This space has been preserved for the purpose of remembering John Hay, who was a very influential Secretary of State, Secretary to President Lincoln, and even a Brown alum. This land is in Newbury, New Hampshire, and it's currently under the purview of the Fells. It's part of the National Register of Historic Places and is a preservation project of the Garden Conservancy. The land around the state is managed by Fish and Wildlife Service and the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests, which has been a long staple in this region as a way to conserve natural spaces. As we come towards our first view of the lake and the mountain, I want to share a quote with you that was written by John Hay about why he moved to this beautiful lake. He says, "The manner in which I came to establish my summer home at Newbury was very simple. I was greatly pleased with the air, the water, and the scenery. I have nowhere found a more beautiful place." And while I do believe that it's true, that Lake Sunapee and the mountain that overlooks it is one of the most beautiful places I have ever seen, the reality of what brought John Hay to this land is actually far more complicated, which is why I want to go back all the way to the indigenous groups that lived here and explore the different intricacies of peoples and decisions and governmental appointments that led to John Hay living here. I'd like to take a moment to explain to you what I mean when I say I'm giving an interpretive talk, because I'm very interested in the medium of how we pass history and stories on to each other. So the term an interpretive talk comes from Freeman Tilden, and he wrote this term for the National Park Service, and he calls it an art form that reveals meaning. It's basically a place-based way for interpersonal information flow, which means that there's the opportunity for audiences to make personal connections. He stresses that people who give interpretive talks are not just scientists and they're not just historians. Instead, they're storytellers that work to tie people to a certain place by telling them stories about it. So here's a quote from him, which says, "Interpretation is an art which combines many arts, whether the materials presented are scientific or historical or architectural. Any art is to some degree teachable." So we see here how this oral form of knowledge transfer is really well respected, especially in park service and conservation spaces. So I want to talk a little bit about the legitimacy of oral traditions as part of knowledge production, because I believe that this shows a stark contrast between the legitimacy offered to oral traditions of white interpreters versus the indigenous people who have often had to fight at every level to legitimize their oral histories. One position says that memories and oral narratives are often portrayed as more subjective than real history. However, as I discussed earlier, the idea of objectivity and subjectivity in history is really relative. So there's really no such thing as an objective truth. So that means that instead of looking for the complete objective truth, we need to look for those situated narratives. And oral histories are a great way to pass on those situated narratives. So I believe that awarding indigenous cultures that have often relied on oral traditions the same legitimacy and right to frame their histories as perhaps conventional white interpreters is a really important step in actively decolonizing, especially given that oral histories are often thrown out of courts of law as hearsay under our European colonialist perception of what counts as a truth. Now, preserving history can be a difficult and at times subjective task. So environmental knowledge production seeks to demonstrate that there is actually no such thing as objective truth, which means that all history is actually part of a subjective narrative that someone has written in their interpretation of events. So as we attempt to analyze what happened specifically on this piece of land, I think it's important that we think about how both our sources and ourselves produce situated narratives, which means that each account is going to look differently for different people. And I think we also need to recognize that a lot of the documents that we have about this place are from very specific types of people. We don't have a lot of records about Indigenous people, and a lot of the records that we do have are from wealthy and affluent elite people. Their stories were memorialized in part because they had a higher propensity to write and because they had a higher wealth level, which allowed them to be their memories to often be preserved for other historical reasons. So for example, John Hay, or on the Hay estate, is often remembered as the Secretary of State, which is in part why there's such an interest in his history here on this land. So many people have left their mark on this landscape, and many people have unknowingly left a mark in attempting to reconstruct the narratives around it.